want to start today by asking you the question, how do you remember things? Like when there is something that you don't want to forget, or something that you need to remember to do, or an event that is coming up, there's all sorts of things we need to remember. But what is the way that you remember things? Here's some examples of common ways of remembering. One is to potentially tie a string around your finger. It's something I never actually understood as a kid when I saw the symbol of a finger with a string around it. But then I realized you look down at your finger and you see the string and you're like, why is that string there? Oh yeah, that's to remind me to do something. Silly way of trying to remember. Maybe you leave a note somewhere. You put post-it notes all over your wall. If you ever see me when I'm in a stressful period, you'll see that there's post-it notes all over my monitor on my desk, reminding me of things to do. Maybe you tape a note to the door as you leave, so you remember to take that item with you that you don't want to forget. Maybe you set a reminder on your phone. Maybe that's one way that you don't forget, something that is going to alert you and remind you, hey, don't forget the thing that you're trying to remember. Or maybe you put an event in your calendar so that you see it coming and you don't forget that it's going to happen. Or maybe you rely on your spouse to remind you, hey, Shelby, don't forget to remind me of the thing. And then if you both forget, well, who really cares, because neither of you will remember anyway. But some ways of remembering are better than others. But remembering is very important. Remembering is important, especially as we remember our past experience, because remembering our past experience is going to inform us for how we act in the future. Remembering our past experience will inform how we act in the future. For example, if you touch a hot stove, you're only going to do that once. You'll experience the pain of touching the hot stove, and then in future, you will make sure that you don't act in that certain way that will cause you to experience the pain again. You'll avoid the hot stove. Or maybe you say something and do something that gets a positive reaction from people. Maybe they laugh at your jokes, or they think highly of you when you act a certain way, and then you keep doing that so that you keep getting the positive reaction. When we learn what's going on in the past, it affects how we're going to act in the future. And this is something that came to the fore for the Israelites as they prepared to enter the promised land. And so today we're going to open the book of Numbers, and we're going to see how remembering helped the Israelites, or maybe didn't help them, as they approached the land God had promised to give them. So if you have your Bible with you, if you're going to open it up to Numbers chapter 13, you may remember the story of the 12 spies. The story of the 12 spies is this: just after the Israelites had escaped Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and they had crossed the Red Sea through God performing a miracle of parting the water so they could cross on dry land, they were journeying towards this promised land that God was going to give them. And as they approached, Moses sent out 12 spies to go and explore the land, to see, is this the land that we've been promised? What does it look like? What can we expect to see there? Does it indeed flow with milk and honey? And so they went out, and after 40 days of exploring the land, those 12 spies returned. And they returned with stories of a fruitful land, but a land that also was filled with giants. So as we read Numbers 13, let's see the response that they had to what they saw. It says this in Numbers 13:26. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and their cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites, they live in the Negev region. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites, they all live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. But then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with them said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it, and the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. And we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. That must have been daunting for the people to hear. After seeing a promised land that was going to be theirs for the taking, to then hear this report from 10 of the spies: yes, it's a wonderful land, but it's also full of big, scary, dangerous giants. There's no way we can defeat them. I mean, we're just a group of nomads who are normal-sized people, and they're giants, so how could we ever hope to defeat them? It's no wonder that the fear took hold and spread like wildfire through the camp. But I'm particularly taken with the attitude of Joshua and Caleb, which seemed quite opposite by comparison. These two spies came back with a different take to the other 10. They said, we can take the land. We can certainly do it because God is on our side. We can do it because God is on our side. And so what was different for these two? Where did their confidence come from? I think clearly it's their faith and trust in God that gave them this confidence. But not just a notional kind of faith and trust, not kind of a faith that comes from just growing up and learning about stories about God in Sunday school or from their parents, but rather they had experienced God for themselves. And because of them seeing firsthand what God could do, they trusted him. And they believed that if God had come through for them before, God will come through for them again. That's what the other spies and the people who were grabbing onto the fear seemed to miss. They seemed to have forgotten that God had been with them in the past and even through those generations of slavery in Egypt. And he'd just miraculously made a way for them to escape Egypt, especially through that Red Sea parting. And for Joshua and Caleb, they saw the giants before them. They saw these incredibly large people and the difficulty it would be in taking the land. But they also had a confidence in God, a God who had proven himself to be bigger than the giants that they were going to face. Shouldn't they still trust that God would be with them now? But when we are facing giants who are big and large and tangible and very visible and right in our faces, it can be so easy to forget the power and the faithfulness of our invisible yet very real God. And so as those other 10 spies saw, just like the rest of the people as they were hearing, as they saw these giant obstacles, they forgot who their God was. They were so overcome by their fear that they forgot what God was capable of. And it's a problem that looks like this. When we forget what God has done, we're going to forget to trust him. When we forget what God has done, we forget to trust him, because if we get complacent about who God is and what he can do, or if we're so used to him moving in our lives, or if we haven't taken note of it, or we haven't thought about it, or even retold the stories, it's not going to be fresh in our minds, and we're not going to naturally think that way. Oh, let's just trust God for this moment. Let's just trust God when we're facing an issue. And we can start to forget what God can do. And if we aren't remembering, we're just going to be overwhelmed by whatever we're facing. And we won't instinctively turn back to God. I think that's what happened for the Israelites here. They were so overwhelmed with the giants in front of them that they forgot who God was, and they weren't trusting him to help them through. And so as a result of their mistrust and their fearing, God forbid them from entering the land for 40 years. He forbid them. That's 1 year for every day the spies were out in the land. A whole generation of Israelites died off, except for Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who had enough faith to believe God could do it. So if we fast forward through those 40 years of wandering, to the end of the wandering in the desert, we get to the book of Joshua. And it becomes time again for the Israelites to have their second crack at entering the promised land. By this time, Moses has passed, and now Joshua is the leader. And they come to the Jordan River, and they're going to have to cross the Jordan River to get to the land. But there's a problem. The Jordan River is in full flow, and it's in full flood. It is uncrossable. And it's not just like a trickly creek that you could just jump over. It's a big, wide, flowing river because it's in full flood. There's no bridges. They can't just cross over a bridge. And so, much like the crossing of the Red Sea, God does the same thing. He parts the sea again. He parts the Jordan River, and the people walk across to the other side. God has miraculously made a way through this unseemingly uncrossable flow of river. I can't swim across a river that's in full flood. I'm sure they couldn't either. But God parted the river again, stopped the river flowing so they could cross on dry ground. He did it again. And after God does that, this is the part I want to get to focus on today, Joshua chapter 4. God then instructs Joshua, build a memorial of what I've just done. so you will remember what just occurred. Let's read it together. Joshua 4, verse 1, and then we'll jump a little bit around in there as well. In Joshua 4, he says this: when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, right where the priests are standing. They were standing there with the Ark of the Covenant, and while the Ark of the Covenant was there, the water was dry. And carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of tribes of the Israelites to serve as a sign among you. And if we skip down to verse 21, he says to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. And he did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. So God's done this thing again. And he says, build a memorial. Don't forget this time. And so they build this memorial of large stones from the riverbed, probably bigger than this, but they start to build a memorial. And they start to build a stack of stones as a reminder of what God had done for them in this place. As a reminder of God, how God had made a way through a seemingly impossible barrier. The idea being that when anyone ever saw these stones, whenever they looked at this pile of stones, they would remember what God did. And their faith and their trust would be renewed. And it wasn't just for the people that day either. I mean, it's funny, you might not realize this, but stones don't naturally stack on top of each other. It's not something that tends to happen. So when they saw this stack of rocks that looked nice and neat, people would notice that and go, particularly the kids who might not have been old enough to realize what happened. As they grow older and they see the stack, they can go, what do these stones mean? And the story can be retold. And the children can be learning what God had done. And they can get more insight into the character and the power and the nature of God and his faithfulness. That's why they were to build this rock memorial, so that they wouldn't forget, so they would remember what God had done. These stones carried a story. They weren't just a pretty monument, they carried a story. And it was a reminder so that people wouldn't forget like they did the first time around. Reminders that would keep them talking about their God, retelling the stories of what he'd done, so that they would be encouraged when they face future giants. Because when we remember what God has done, we can be confident to face those giants. When we remember what God has done, we are confident to face those giants. I wonder if you have any memorials in your life or any rock-type memories. Stories of where God has moved, that has affected your life in such a way that you go, that was only God. Or maybe he led you to do something or broke through some kind of barrier or obstacle. Maybe he healed you. Maybe he defeated a giant. Remembering those stories of what God has done is important for us because it serves to remind us of what he's done before, and it reignites our faith. When I remember these stories, it makes me go, yeah, that's the God I serve. He's not dead. He's not distant. He's right here, alive and caring about my life. And it helps me to trust his promises of what is to come, especially when I'm in those times of struggle, when I'm in those times of doubt or those times of fear. When I remember the stories of what God has done, that lifts me up and keeps me going. One of the first pieces of advice I ever got when I said, I think God's telling me I should become a pastor. One of those first pieces of advice was write down your call story. Write down the story of how you worked out that God was telling you to be a pastor. Of how I came to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is what God wanted me to do. And that I found has been great advice. Because when things have been hard, when there's been moments when I'm like, should I even be doing this? Am I good enough to do this? This is hard, working with people. Ugh. You guys are fine. But when I'm in those places of struggle and self-doubt and wondering, should I even be doing this at all? Going back and rereading that story and reminding myself that I didn't just come up with this idea myself. God led me to it. Because let me tell you, I never wanted to be a pastor when I was younger. In those moments when I reread the story and I remember the call, that's what I've needed to keep me going and moving in my journey, to reignite my passion for what God has called me to do. Writing down my story has been like stacking a bunch of rocks in my own life. I mean, just in my own call story, I'll show you some tidbits. As I started thinking about pastoring, I wasn't sure if it was a call from God at first. Maybe it was just me trying to find a way to get out of the job I was in. But then I started hearing certain things throughout my life, from sources that weren't related, from places that I would not have expected, that made me go, maybe God is trying to catch my attention. Sitting in a service where the speaker said, there are people in this room who are about to become pastors and don't even know it, and then feeling a physical sensation in my gut where the Holy Spirit was going, that's you. That's a rock. Traveling to Romania, of all places. If that smashes, I'm sorry. Jackie, you should see Jackie's face every time I drop one in. But when I was in Romania, on the other side of the planet, I was there with a couple of people who were doing like a mission exposure trip, I'll call it. We met two missionaries who were from England. And they met us there in Romania, and we're working alongside them. And they pulled me aside one day and go, Ben, we just feel like God's telling us to tell you, you're going to be a pastor. And I'm like, what? I'm hearing this from all over the place. Now I'm hearing it on missionaries from England in Romania. I mean, okay. Rock. I had a close friend who I shared an office with, and he had the spiritual gift of word of knowledge. And eventually, he could have told me this earlier, but eventually he shared with me that early on when I started talking about this, he had a vision from God of me as a pastor working in that space. And I knew that he had these things. It wasn't just a random, I got this idea. No, I'd seen him do this with other people. When he told me that story, a rock. Many other rocks that came along the path. But that's just some significant markers for me that helped me go, I think God's calling me to this path. But even then, after I'd gone, yeah, rocks, excellent, I'm doing this, I was right on the edge of the precipice of making the call to quit my job and to go to Bible college and to start pursuing whatever it looked like. I didn't know what I was doing. I started putting up all these obstacles to God going, you know what, God, if I do this, this is all the things that are going to go wrong. I started putting up fears of what may or may not happen. And then that very weekend, as I did that to God, I was sitting in another service, listening to a preacher who started preaching from Joshua 1 verse 8. And if you're familiar with that verse, it's where Joshua said, be bold, be strong, go forward, for the Lord your God is with you. And the speaker was encouraging us that if anything that God is leading you towards is scaring you, stand up and do it with boldness, because God will go with you. Rock. One of my obstacles was saying to God, where is my finance going to come from? I'm in a nice job, about to be a student again. What's going to happen? As soon as I quit my full-time job, though, they turned around and said, would you like to come back and work casually for 2 days a week while you're studying? And that gave me enough income to cover my barest expenses. Thank you, God. That sorted that problem. I also received several anonymous gifts over my time of studying that got me through extra places. Like sometimes I didn't even tell anyone I was struggling with this stuff, and an envelope would appear in my letterbox with the right amount that I was needing, and a little note saying, God told me to give this to you. Love, Anonymous. I'm like, I'd love to go thank that person, but God providing again. Rock. God showed me that if he had called me to do something, he would be with me and he would go with me and provide the means for it to happen. Every time I threw up a fear at God or an obstacle at God, he was like, watch this. And these are just some of the rocks that have reminded me that God has called me to do what I do now, to be a pastor. But it hasn't just been in that space either. Just been in my normal everyday life. Learning that God is a healer was a huge rock for me. When I was a teenager, I had a friend who was into state hockey, and he was a player. And he hobbled into church one week and he had a knee injury from his last game. Like, he literally hobbled in. And he was waiting to get some test results back that week to see if he would ever be able to play again, if the injury was that bad or if it was deal-withable. That's even a word, isn't it? Deal-withable? You know what I mean. Thank you. It's in the dictionary. Andrew says yes. Our pastor said, hey, you want to pray over this? And my friend goes, yeah. Would you like us to pray for healing? Well, yeah. And so us inexperienced young adults gathered around him, and we're like, we don't know what we're doing. So the pastor led us through anointing with oil, as the book of James says to do. And then we prayed, and we just simply asked God to heal him. I didn't know what to expect, but after we prayed, he said, the pain's starting to subside a bit, which was cool, but a bit weird. But that's kind of where it landed. That's where it ended. And we all went home. Turns out the next day he goes to the doctor, who's holding the test results in one hand and looking at my friend going, have I got the right patient? Because the test results said one thing, the way he's standing on his legs said another. And he came back to church the next week declaring God had healed him, and he literally jumped up and down on the stage as he shared his testimony. Did he go on to hockey greatness? No. But did he now fully trust God and had a story to tell of his faithfulness, that even in a hockey injury, God could still come through? Yes. And did that show me that just praying is a way to ask God for healing? Yeah. Rocks. That's a story I go back to time and again when I'm asking God for healing in my life or other people's lives. And these are just some more rocks in my own life of going, this is how I remember who God is. This is how I remember the power that he has had. He still has, but where he's acted and moved in my life. But it's not just pastors who need rocks. We all need them. We all need to build rock monuments. We all need to be able to look back on our lives and recognize moments where God has been with us in those dark moments, or helped us and led us, or healed us, or provided for us. We need to remember those things. And I wonder, as you think over your life and your journey, what rock moments might come to your mind now? In what ways have you experienced God in the past? What moments stand out to you as rocks that remind you of who God is? These things are important for us in our personal faith, but I think there's also room for corporate rocks, group rocks, rocks that remind us of things in a group setting. Like the rocks in Joshua. During my time at my last church, we were discerning God's call to start a second campus, to plant another school. It was a church with a school attached. We were sensing God saying, plant another school with a church in the middle of that as well. But even before the second campus came, the story of when the first campus was built was often told. I was not there, but I could tell you what's happened in that story. And it's a story of God providing the land, providing the finance, and breaking through barriers in ways that only God can. And when that campus was completed, one of the trees that was cut down and cleared to make way for the buildings, it was taken and repurposed and turned into a pulpit. It was a weird-looking pulpit, if you think of that two logs sort of balanced, but it was a monument for the people to remember God made this campus happen. A corporate rock. And now we were being called to do it all again. And I won't tell you the full story because we'll be here for a couple more hours, but as a church, we started praying and spending a lot of time remembering this is what God did in the first campus. We're trusting him for the second one. And after months of praying and listening, we discerned, yes, this is God definitely calling us forward. So yeah, we rocks and we went forward. But then the real problems hit. We found a large piece of land at a reasonable price. It was really incredibly low. We thought this is great, but the reason it was low price was because it has the WA main gas pipeline running through the middle of it. While it would make it near useless for any other organisation, for us building a school, you can just put an oval over it because the issue is getting access to that pipeline. However, facing the WA Planning Commission to get the permission to be able to build around the pipeline and put the oval on there, that was like a giant. Then going through many tribunals to convince the government that putting a school on a major truck route was in fact a good and a safe idea. That was another giant. Getting construction off the ground, that was another giant. And throughout it all, it was a difficult process, especially for the key people working on the project. But over and over throughout it, as a church, we reminded ourselves, here's the story of how God made the first campus happen through his miraculous provision. We're trusting him now. We're reminding ourselves of the clear call he gave. Through those months of discerning, we got clear stories of God saying yes. There was a moment when we were considering the land, that we were praying on it, and we received a sign from God that we believed him saying, yes, this is the land. Remembering these were all rocks that made us go, yes, we are trusting God for this second campus to happen. And it's happened. Carey Forestdale has been going for nearly 10 years now. But we know it was God who made it happen. Because when you look at all the factors, it shouldn't have happened under human circumstances. It was only God making a way forward that caused it to happen. And so again, we cut down a tree on the new land, set it aside to be used as a reminder of God's provision. Now that's a story of someone else. We here at Como have a story we're in the middle of. Christine's been alluding to it today. Right now we're in the middle of the story of Chapel Hill and getting that moving and getting that off the ground. It's a story of not just a building project and a nice idea, but a call from God to do something radical with what we have. It's a call to build a community and a call to create a place and a space where the love of God can be shared and experienced, where disciples can be made, where people can gather and live and work together in a place where they will experience God. And our church gets to be at the center of that. That's the story currently being written. But right now, as Christine shared before, there are some difficult giants that we're facing. Housing costs are rising. Construction costs are inflating. Time was lapsing on our permission, but thankfully God came through and made that extension happen. There's a whole bunch of other things happening too, but the driving factor behind it is knowing that God has the one who came up with this idea. It wasn't just Phil and Jackie sitting in their living room one day over coffee going, it would be cool if we built some towers. I don't think that's what happened. That's not what happened, is it? No. You don't even like coffee, do you? No. No, this project is not something that just came up out of the blue. But it's also not something new either. It's been going for at least 15 years that I know of. And there have been times of movement and things accelerating and times of waiting and watching and slowing down. Times of asking God to make a way through barriers. And for the group of people who've been right in the middle of this journey, the project group, there have been some rocks that have kept them going. Rocks of remembering God's story and God's call for Como Baptist Church. Now, some of you have been part of Como, like we've been here, 93 years? Some of you have been here 93 years. Some of you, like me, have only been here 12, 18 months. Different points of the journey along the way. And some of you who've been here for a while saw this project grow from the small seed it started at to what it is today. For those like myself who've joined more recently, just in the last few years, you might not know the story of how Chapel Hill started. And you're just going, oh yeah, there's a building project, there's posters on our doors that paint a picture of what it could be. But I recently had the privilege of listening to Phil and Jackie sharing the history of Chapel Hill with other Baptist pastors. And I learned a few things about how God has been leading every step of the way on this journey. And it got me thinking. Like Joshua laid stones of remembrance for the people to remember what God had done in Israel, what if we laid some stones again today to remember and remind ourselves how God called us onto this journey so that those of us who were here at the start can be remembering this is God, not just us pushing a rock up a hill. And those of us who are new, like the children of Israel, can go, tell me the story, help me understand, help me know. Because it's important to retell the story of God's faithfulness and his calling and his promises. To remind ourselves of where he's moved and acted so that the future generations know what God has done here. So rather than assume I know anything of this story, I have asked Phil and Jackie to share today, hence why we've got some extra chairs here. And while we don't have time for the hours and hours to dig through every God moment that has been and to share the entire story, we're going to ask them to share a couple of highlights from the project to help remind us of what God has called us to do. How he's come through for us in the past so that we will trust him for the future. It's that importance of remembering so that we can approach the future in the way that we'll be trusting God. So if you guys want to come up, and as they're coming up, it is Inspire Sunday, as Phil said. And normally we would do sharing time on Inspire Sunday. A time when we let people come up and share stories of what God has been doing, where God has been acting. And we will have opportunity at the end today, hence why you've got some rocks on your chairs. If you want to share a God story, like a short one, don't go for 20 minutes. But if you want to share a short God story rock that reminds you, don't throw it from there, Tom. That will break it. But I will be inviting you at the end to share stories if you would like to. But Phil and Jackie, thank you so much for agreeing to come up here, especially when you're not in control. That can be scary. Oh, you guys are so far away. I didn't plan this well, did I?
It's fine. It's fine.
It's fine? All right, cool. So Phil and Jackie, thank you for coming out to share. I've asked you to come and talk about the history of Chapel Hill, but I thought maybe could you start by sharing with us some of the story of how you knew God was calling this church to embark on Chapel Hill, this crazy undertaking of building towers and doing whatever it is that we're doing.
Thank you, Ben. It is, I think, thank you for your lead into the service too. It's good to stop and take a moment. Prior to returning to Como, I was here as a youth pastor and had the opportunity to serve, and then Jackie went down to Carey and we served there for a bit. Sitting on the porch at the back of Beveridge Street where I lived, trying to decide whether it's right to serve together and come back to Como. The Isaiah passage, which we're currently using right now as our theme, was what spoke to me. So when you talk about God confirming you personally, the Lord will guide you always, satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and strengthen your frame, and you'll be like a well-watered garden. I've often had to go back to that. Yeah, go back and go, Lord, I'm not feeling that inspired or spring right there, and there's been times that he's continued to grow. Then there's a second part of the verse. You will rebuild the age-old foundations, and you raise up many generations. You'll be restorers of streets with dwellings, and restorers of the breach. Now, that was in my heart. I couldn't figure it out back then. Now, we went through the stage of the renovation rebuild. So there was a restoring of age-old foundations. That's when we first arrived, when the thing collapsed, and we had to. So there's something sort of really connecting there, raising up the age-old foundations of how this church ministered to children and families, and bang, not only that, how we did it practically, but that they did it way back then when it first started, was ministering to people in the local area. And along came, which that lady over there, Fern Maynard, and many others who had a passion for ministering to people in the local area, and then came along the childcare centre. Wow, okay. And then this restoring of streets with dwellings. That confirmation of something physically housing, living, dwelling, I couldn't see what that was, and this was 15 years ago, and it's a confirmation that, my goodness, this is now coming into being prophetically in my own biblical story.
Yeah, there's a few things around that. So 2003 to 2005, Phil was the youth pastor here, and the church was actually looking at building a 2-storey place. Some of you will know this. There was a building project going ahead. Plans had been drawn up by an architect, and the church was really poised. It was, 180, 200 people on a Sunday morning. Really felt like something was happening, and God interrupted that in a way that none of us understood at the time. It did mean that Phil and I ended up moving. I was called to Carey, where Ben has been serving. And during the 3 years we were away, we came back, and I remember being at the interview in 2008. So pastoral transition in 2005 stopped the project in its tracks. And I think it's fair to say that that was a very low time for the church, those intervening years, as they wrestled to figure out what we were convinced of in 2004-05 in this building project just didn't proceed. And this rapid pastoral change. So I think there was quite a bit of... it was a difficult time. It was a wandering time. So when we came back to interview in 2008, because Phil had received a word from Isaiah, I was really content where I was, and I had been given a word from Nehemiah, and I was preaching it at Carey and realised that this wasn't a message for Carey, it was actually a message for Como. And when I did eventually preach that, it was the first time I've said, I'm not usually prophetic, but there's a storm a-coming. And in 2010, a week later, within 5 days of that message, a storm did come and actually destroyed a year's worth of renovation work. So what had happened is when Phil and I interviewed for the pastorate, we said, why continue? And I can remember, and I'm pretty sure it was Anton Clow, looking at me and going, well, a lot's happened since you've been away. They're rezoning this whole area, and soon it's going to be a multi-storey renovated area. And if we, the church, don't exist, the church will never get back in here. We need to. We need to be here. And right, okay. So, this concept, and there was a building program planned, a renovation program already planned, and that was to renovate and refresh this building. That's when the storm came in 2010 and destroyed a year's worth of work. Quite literally, if you weren't here, every ceiling in this church fell down in
Take the
2010.
rock out.
No, you put the rock back in because people didn't flinch. They were down here. We knew the storm was coming over. Phil was actually on the roof at the time. Yep. Okay, that's a long. Anyway, we could have looked at that and gone, wow, a year's worth of work is destroyed. What is God's doing? But people didn't. In fact, I think it really strengthened us. There were some instances in there where we dealt with some past sin as a result of that, and some current sin that was happening. And so there was a renewal to our spiritual endeavour there. So where were the moments? That was actually pivotal. They were pivotal. The other pivotal moment was actually just monitoring. So we've been monitoring what's been happening for 15 years. So 5 years in, all of the changes happened with state zoning and everything. We'd opened the centre. 10 years in, I think had talked to a couple of developers and wondering what it was we would be doing. And because I work at the Baptist Union, I knew the CEO of BFS was coming across. And I didn't know David particularly well, but I had a free afternoon. He needed chauffeuring. So I said, hey, do you want to have a look at our site just to see whether you think something can be done here? Because at the moment, nothing has really inspired us. It wasn't filling that vision of Isaiah, of a restorer, of a place, of something to invite people to. And David come and walked around, and he's really understated, and he stood and he said, oh, yeah, I think there's something that could be done here. I went, right, expecting him to be as excited as I was. But he's fairly straight, and I had no idea whether he was happy or not. But when he came back and he said, no, I'd like to show you a few places in Melbourne, and quite a few people put up some money, and we flew to Melbourne and looked at some sites, and then we understood what was going on in David's mind. And it was at that point that we went, Isaiah 58 is now really starting to make sense for us. So there's some pivotal moments apart from, people just... Yeah, there's too many stories for where we go. But can I just say, in 2009, a lot of what we did in prep for the renovation was actually, and Phil led this really well, was we all went back over our history over the last 80 years. We did discover why God had placed Como where it was, why God had led people to minister to children and families. We really did go back in that time and start laying rocks and listening and saying where that was. Sorry, not a short answer. Go.
That's all right.
So there's Bible verse, and meeting David. For me, meeting John and Rudy and the team, when they arrived in that process, for me, do I love these people? Like, is our vision to love, inspire, to go and to live life? Can I trust these people? Can we trust them? Do we have a loving relationship, or are they just into it for the money and the characteristics of business? Do they inspire us with their ideas? And is it missional? Like, do they want just to build something for the sake of building, or is there a missional heart so that we can... and can I share my faults and difficulties and be discipled? Can I share life in this process? So those 4 key values meant something as we spoke to them. And so John and Rudy, when they did the surveys and sat with us, that was a pivotal moment to say, we've found the people who understand the vision and purpose. So we can journey with the long haul. Phil and Deb Heathcote have gone up to visit John and Rudy. They're the designers who are not believers, but they've come to know so much about how we... So they visited them in Sydney. We visited them when we've gone over there. We visited and prayed with David and sort of health things and that along that whole journey. So it's been lived out already. So that was another pivotal moment. Does the team understand the vision and the purpose of us, or are they just seeing this as another project that they can wipe off the church and make money out of? and we felt we were aligned on that purpose. So that was another vision. So that's answering question number 2.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, so that's fantastic. Hearing that God started this idea, planted seeds through the Isaiah verse and what was going on here at Como at the time, finding people who are in alignment with the vision, who would work alongside us and not just come in and bring their own agenda, that's awesome. But then that's great when God leads us. What happens when giants pop up and obstacles are faced? Do you have any stories of where God has made ways through unseemingly difficult times?
I think so. There's the practical side of the build, and there are practical things in the build, but there's the practical side about being church. And I think one of those challenges, which we are facing again, and I'm going to put this challenge out again today, is at the end of 2019, we said if we want to proceed with this project, we must have at least 6 elders. And we put the challenge out, and people stepped up into eldership because we would need that. We're going to be saying that again this year. We need elders because the church has to continue being church and preparing for what is to come. If we're going to hand this on to a new generation, we're not actually handing on a building. We're actually handing on what it is to be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ. That is what will restore this place. The building is a mechanism, or the creation of place, because it's not a building. We're creating a whole open area. This will be open area which people can gather in. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the chapel is there and this is a plaza? Our church is just there, and people are going to be sitting right here, listening, hearing, walking, having coffee. And we need to be ready to actually engage in that space. So when we're talking about that, it's the calling of leaders to actually step up. I was reminded this morning of the eunuch running alongside, who he runs along Philip is running alongside the carriage. The eunuch hears the word of God, and Philip says to him, "What prevents you from being baptised today?" He said, "Nothing." And I'm going to ask the same question today. What prevents you from being actively involved in leading and serving in this place? I think that is a giant to face, because to be honest, I hear you this morning and I go, our leadership is in a good spot, is it not? The future of pastoral leadership is in a good place. And that for us has been a real challenge over years. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Some other, do you want to put a few rocks for that, or what's anyway? The purchasing of the triangular block across the road. So I just need to say there's a God divine circumstance. That was up for sale, and other organisations were going to buy it and therefore build something which would block us out from vision, which we'd have 2 competing organisations side by side, and there was some industry that was going to be used there. Could even be a childcare centre, could even be other cafes or things. So there'd be this complexity in the same spot. I looked over to see whether we could hire it, because one of the other vision is that I don't want the church to move off site. I want us to worship and to meet and to have a presence through it all. And that chapel over there has to remain on site. 2 criteria that we've said in the process. BDA bought that across there. Now, that's a pretty...
BDA are the development arm.
Baptist family, they bought that for, I'm going to say how many million, to back up what we're doing here, so that the gap in between becomes community engagement, purpose and place. Every other building around, you see it's built out to the side. There's no way of meeting people. They're just like glass doors and ramps straight in. There's no community. So they saw the capacity of vision to buy that. Now, that's a bold step. It's not financially viable. It's very tight. It's the hardest building in Perth, so we've heard, to actually make it viable, the triangular space and size, plus a tree in the middle of it. It'll be a miracle, and it's going to be a miracle when people are living there, because that in itself is not the one that'll make funds. This is a site that'll have more income. So they've invested something just to get it, so we have community in the long run, space to use. So that's a real huge test of trust and faith. And the way it came about, with them being willing enough to buy it and to back us, it means that they're invested for the long haul. So that was a real moment of
And
transition.
their investment is actually in the belief of the mission. It's not about the actual dollars. Their investment is, and as recently as our last visit a couple of months ago, they've said they're committed to the project because they're committed to the vision that we hold. That is significant because, some days that I feel like going, that's too big for us. That can only be God and all of us that actually commit to that vision. And there's people putting up millions of dollars to support us. If we step back now, and I don't mean Phil and I, I'm talking about us as a community, because right now it'd be easy to go, this is getting a bit hard, we're getting smaller in number, how is this going to work? Then be bold, be strong. The Lord your God is with you.
One more before you finish. I think you've got the last question, is the naming of the site. God-divined moment. I didn't want us to be called some random project that you can't speak the purposes of God in what you say. Chapel Hill, obviously, that wasn't called a chapel at the beginning. That was just the Como Hall. And we called it chapel because we had 3 halls here to designate. That's now been called the identity. So we can tell a story of how that was built by faithful people in the naming of the whole location. So when someone asks something, why is it called Chapel Hill? Well, let me tell you. In 1931, a lady called Sue donated $1,000 to make that, and she was there. And that's the marker point that I have written on this here, of the person who started this. And this is my marker stone that one day will be completed, to tell the story of the beginning, the story of the start, the story of the end. And when we have a 100-year anniversary, when this finally finishes, the whole thing will be at 100 years old. That's a future prophetic hope that God will do. And the naming of this, and Christine just alluded to the naming of the specific sites, that was another moment of transformation for me, because even those who were sitting on the development team who weren't believers, I was sitting up one night going, I don't want it to be named something else. So I was sending out Chewett Tree, Westgate, Eastgate, all the biblical stories of the gates of Jerusalem. I was sending out Olive Tree, trying all these names of what it could be called, so we could have a Christian identity. When people say, I'm going to, they're actually speaking something of God's purposes without them knowing it. I sent them one night at 2 a.m, what about the 3 disciples, Peter, James and John? And I did a quick research of Peter's being the rock and James being the just and John being the beloved. Sent them off to the naming people who were about to name the site or name things. And the guy just had a Bible study of his own. He said, and he came back and he wrote the history of Peter being the rock and James being the just, and he wrote the history of John being the beloved. So the site in itself, to be called the promontory, is the prominent rock, the one who stands out, triangular. He's a bit abrupt, like Peter is. James, the tall one, the brother, the older brother is James. Now they're going to find the equivalent of James the Just as in some iteration of that name.
Probably veracity.
And then John, the beloved, the close one, embraced with 2 arms, the bridge going across, because we wanted a bridge mechanism to tell the bridge story to Canning Bridge, and they've made a bridge in the architecture. There's like stones along that journey. It goes, God put some things into place. So we don't know what those next 2 names will be of this site, but we know that one's called the promontory. So the naming is a significant part of my heart, that it stays God-focused in what people say without them knowing it, so we can tell the story of how it began. And hopefully we will do that one day when it's completed.
I know there's lots more of the story that you'd love to share, and I know you've got so many notes, and I also know time's running away.
Yep.
Is there anything right now that we could be praying into? Like, what giant things are we facing? You mentioned elders, but are there any others as well?
Yeah, I think Christine's covered off earlier all of the project side of things. I do think eldership is there, but we need to pray for a revival amongst us, not just in our outreach, but in how we continue to disciple and do things. Weariness is a real problem. It is a problem. It is a challenge. And I think sometimes, and I think the place, COVID has had lots and lots of impact. And the world scenario continues in those uncertain times. That leaves a level of weariness. And I think you alluded to sometimes it can feel like you're pushing the rock uphill. I think it's time for us to just sort of stop worrying about pushing the rock uphill and to be focusing on our own reformations, if you like, and reforming, and us stepping out like we are beginning to in those community engagements. That's where our focus needs to be. The building will then take care of itself. A lot of that's out of our control. What is in our control is what we continue to go out and do. And I actually think that's a bit of a rock right now. Yeah.
Cool.
I think pray for the finances. Those who have purchased in, they need to have a viable place, and pray that when we have engagement with people soon, they'll get to understand Christ's purposes here, and that this idea of, and even the marketers when we met them, to say this is different. You're selling a place where people can connect, not just a building. And they said, you've got a point of difference. So, but that has to be delicate. Not everyone wants to live next to a church. So we have to manage that in the best way that is careful. So pray that happens carefully, and that we, the church, continue to flourish right now. They're the 2 prayer points I've got for you. Thank you for letting us to catch up again. Both Ben and Shelby, seeing these 2 servers is really encouraging, mate. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for sharing today and reminding us of the story. Yeah, give them a clap as they head back down. I mean, that story is much bigger than just that, but those are some highlights so that retell and help us remember what is going on in this place. It's not just a development, it's not just a project, it's things that are going on. I did offer before, I know time is running away, but does anyone have like an urgent story they would love to share of a rock moment in their life? That's fine. No, that's okay. As we come up, yes, please come join.
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Faz. Maybe not many of you guys know us. We just started coming here last year. I've been, since I came to Australia, I've been going through a lot, but had a lot of doubtful moments and dark moments. And I always, whenever I came to my faith, I tried to trade with God. God, if you do this, I'll do this. And a few weeks back, by off chance, I came across the passage that Jesus is being tempted by the devil, and he replies, and it has been said, you shall not test your God. And it was a moment for me that what I have been trying to do with God was not right. A couple of weeks, like this is happening a few weeks, and a couple of weeks ago, I'm riding my road bike, and it was a gift, less than 3 weeks old. And I'm going from South Perth, coming back. I get distracted, and I hit a pole. I hit it so hard that the bike snapped in half. And but I didn't even have a scratch, nothing. Like, it was like a miracle to me that nothing happened to me. And that was a moment for me that told me that God always is there. There's always a sign. Sometimes we just don't get to see it, or we just are so busy with ourselves. And God doesn't have to prove himself to us. So that was my moment. I thought I would share with you guys.
Thank you, Pes. That's great. Thank you. That's a rock. You would have all noticed the rock left on your chair this morning. And I've left rocks around for those people in the kids area. I just sort of put them on the edge. But the idea was you can take this home with you and to remember your rock stories. The ones that I've shared, the ones that Faz has shared, the ones that Jackie and Phyllis shared, they're our stories, but remember your stories. And put this rock somewhere where you'll see it, I don't know, on top of your microwave or next to your computer or on your mantle or a windowsill, I don't know. Maybe you want to take a marker and write a word or two that reminds you of the story. But the idea is that you can take the rock home and when you see it, remember where God has worked in your life so that you won't forget, so you remember to trust him. That's up to you if you want to take that or not. But retelling the stories, remembering what God has done, helps us as we face giants ahead of us. It helps us as we approach the future. So I encourage you to remember what God has done. Why don't we pray together? Father God, we thank you for your word and the stories contained in it that help us learn more about you. And God, as we see the Israelites in the book of Joshua building this memorial of stones to remind them of who you are, we see that you have been suggesting, remember who I am, reminding us of who you are, God. God, I pray that the places where you have moved in our lives, that we wouldn't forget those, that we wouldn't forget the stories of the Bible, but that we also wouldn't forget the stories of where you have moved today or in our past. God, that they would be things that help form a foundation for our faith, that help us to remember who you are, that we've seen you in action before. We know you can do it again. God, that it would build our faith and reignite us. God, as we look forward in Chapel Hill, you've heard this morning some of the concerns we have, and we can only ask, God, would you make a way through these concerns? God, as we look for the clear leadership, as we look through elders, as we look for the finances, as we look for how that community is coming together, as we look for how the government is playing their part and all the development stuff and things I don't understand, God, we bring it all before you and say, God, you have led us this far. We trust you to lead us in the future. God, help us to trust you in it. And thank you that as you move, we can see your power at work. God, help us to remember who you are. In your name I pray today. Amen.